I'm going to present some material that might be actually completely different from anything else that we've heard today, because my perspective on what we're doing is slightly different because of where I'm coming from. As director of the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies, and as a professor of the Middle Ages, I am also coming at the question of borders from a totally different perspective. But I've been thinking about this question for a number of years. I'm really interested in the formation of the idea of borders, where we get our ideas about borders in the modern world. And so when we started talking, when I became director of the center, and when we started talking with Latin American Studies at Michigan about this project, I was really excited about the possibilities for comparison. And I think it can be really useful for all of us to put these local questions, these on-the-ground immediate questions, in a broad historical context. And I think it can be a useful pedagogical strategy as well for students of all ages to start thinking relatively about the things that they take for granted. Borders, border problems, politics, if we put them in a broader frame and start asking questions about where they come from, why they're there, how they could be different, we can really generate a lot of conversations that are not simply tied to the local question. But we start asking really broad, almost philosophical questions about what we're even talking about and what assumptions we're making as educators and what students are bringing to the table as learners. So I'm really excited about the possibilities of this. Just a warning, a word of warning, that it's a little bit weird compared to everything else we've heard. So I'll be the outlier, but that's okay. I'm really excited to present some of this material to you.
Most of what I'm about to present on borders and border walls is based directly on the work by geographer Rhys Jones from the University of Hawaii. I encourage all who want to follow up on these ideas to see his work, above all his study, Border Walls.
I think that borders present us with a compelling problem, because when we talk about migration through space, and especially migration over established borders, we're thinking about maybe multiple things at once, multiple phenomena. And I think this question is compelling to everyone today for reasons that have to do with our particular world. I think that where we are today is in a paradox. We're caught, in a sense, in globalization between opposite forces, between a sense of connectivity and really a shrinking world in which everything seems more and more connected. We have more capabilities to communicate faster and quicker and with more data and with more information over greater distances. We can Skype with friends in China and in South Africa and wherever. And at the same time, we're increasingly divided. As Professor Bellino noted, more walls have been constructed in the last 30 years than in the history of humanity. And really, I tried to add them up once to actually, measure the kilometers and think about this. And I don't want to stand 100% behind it, but I think my calculations reveal that essentially all of the walls that have been built are more kilometers in the last 30 years than all of the different spurs of the Great Wall of China. So if we can sort of put that into perspective, some 23,000 kilometers roughly. So you can fact check that. But anyway, I wanted to throw that out there as a comparison. The idea that we've been doing more work in the last 30 years to separate ourselves and to create barriers and to inhibit or prohibit or slow down migration than all of human history has done with its walls. So I think now is a particularly important and interesting time to think about borders and the problem or the paradox that borders present us with, especially young people, because they're the ones, that is younger than me at least, they're the ones who are really in this new world of connectivity. And yet at the same time are hearing all the bad news constantly about how many problems and divisions and barriers there are. So I think maybe this is an opportunity as well, if we can tap into this paradox and really recognize that students are fighting against contrary ideas. I wanted to put in perspective why I'm going to talk about other borders. I think it's really important to think globally about borders and migration, but just to put in perspective, you may be thinking in the back of your mind, yeah, but the Mexican, US-Mexico border is the most important one, or the biggest one, or the busiest one. And technically, in terms of number of crossings, I think this is the busiest one. But in terms of migrants moving around the globe right now, it's not. That is, if we look at the number of migrants measured by the UN recently, North American migration is big. definitely. But there's a lot of migration going on in other parts of the world that we don't think about. And a lot of it is forced, a lot of it is stressed, a lot of it is over really, really violent borders or through really contested space. So Europe is facing a huge border crisis, or what we could call a border crisis, if we think about borders as really broadly regional borders. The Mediterranean Sea is an enormous international border right now where thousands of people are dying every year. So we have to kind of try to be flexible in thinking about what borders are we talking about. The question of border crossings or migration across space is a global issue right now. And so when we think about what we can bring to the table looking at this local question, we can definitely make it meaningful by showing our credentials and saying, look, this is actually a global issue. It's all over the world and it's happening in lots of really parallel ways. So I just wanted to throw this out there that it's increasing everywhere, and it's increasing in other places. There's more migration happening in other places. So let me stop and tell you a little bit about my perspective. Now you're going to say, what? Wait, am I in the wrong room? I wanted to tell you where I'm coming from. So I don't actually work on the modern world at all. Disclosure, I don't actually work on borders directly. I don't work on the United States or Mexico. I'm a professor of Spanish, but that's just a cover for what I actually do, right? A secret identity, which is I work on the world before the modern borders were formed. I work on the Middle Ages in a period before Spain was even Spain, before Spanish was even Spanish. And I'm really interested in the formation of the things we now take for granted. And in particular, the spread, the very rapid and violent, often violent spread of the Spanish Empire. Right around the end of the 15th century, so think Columbus, 1492, and what happens after it. Remember that it was only 50 years to the almost exact month that San Diego was discovered by the Spaniards after Columbus. So between 1492 and 1542, the Spaniards were already in San Diego, right? So just to put that on the table. I'm really interested in trying to broaden our perspective on what we're talking about. And so where am I coming from? I look at Spain in the moment when it's shifting, right? It's okay you don't know any of this history, I'm not going to really torture you, but I wanted to just tell you where I'm coming from. I'm looking at a world in which Spain was not yet Spain, and the borders we take for granted were not yet there. There were other borders. It was also a land in which what we think of as Spain was made up by other types of people that you may not have heard of or may have forgotten about. That is, the Christian Spain that spread through the Spanish Empire and that colonized California and Mexico and all of Spanish America was a Spain that had just triumphed over many minority populations, and particularly had just fought a long war against Muslim populations that had been in the peninsula since the 7th century, well, early 8th century, and that had also really dominated the peninsula when Arabic was actually the language of the Iberian Peninsula, this land we call Spain, not the Romance languages. And in that population, there was also another population of Jews. The largest Jewish population anywhere in the world at the time was in Spain. So these two populations exist kind of in the shadows of the history of the Spanish Empire and the history of their expulsion or their forced conversion or simply their incorporation into the empire in ways that were not particularly welcoming really is part of the larger story of how our modern borders in the Hispanic Empire are formed. So that's where I'm coming from. I won't torture you with lots of details, but I will show you some weird things from this period. Things I want to bring to the table. What are the questions I'm asking by offering this larger frame? One thing I want to think about is just, again, going back to Professor Bellino's talk, what is a border, right? It's a simple question. What are we talking about when we say migration or migration over a border? What do we mean by a border? And specifically, where do we get that? Where did our modern idea of what a border is actually come from? You might think it's obvious, but we might start to challenge it and offer ways for our students to challenge that question. Ask them philosophical questions and say, well, what about this? A third question I want to ask is, what are the consequences of this particular way of thinking of borders, which I'll call modern borders or modern border thinking? What are the consequences of it for us, for modern politics, and for really moving forward to make less violent borders or better migration? And in particular, how can this broader history, this framing, help us do what is the impetus of this conference, which is really what we're calling rehumanizing, right? Rehumanizing migration. that really packs a lot, because it implies that A, migration has become dehumanized, and that even more, migration is implicitly a human or humane practice. It's something that is at the heart of human life. You may think, well, why do we have to say that? Because what is migration? It's a practice that involves all aspects of human identity. So it's not simply about movement through space. It's a question of community. It's a question of defining identity and difference, who we are and who we're not, who are our neighbors, who are our enemies. And it's also a question of power, of how we're going to establish social systems of power and either defend them, expand them, or reform them. So I think the question of migration is really a human or humane question, because it touches on all of these ethical, or what could really be thought of as moral questions. So the border and migration need to be rehumanized, because they have been dehumanized. And they've been dehumanized by practices that we may need to interrogate. So that's what I'm bringing to you. Let me start with my first question. I don't know if I'll get through everything, but I'll try. My first question, a simple one again, and I think Professor Bellino did a super helpful job in actually covering stuff, so I don't have to say a lot that I was going to say, which is great. But I want to think about this as a problem. What is a border really? What does it mean to say we're going to talk about a border? Does anyone know what this is?
Those are what they just put on the Rio Grande.
Right.
The floaters to create another way of dividing it.
Right. This is the new floating border of Governor Greg Abbott on the Rio Grande in Texas. And so it's a really interesting juxtaposition of two possible ways of thinking of what a border is. We might take for granted that a border is actually a natural landmark or a division, that is there. But I think that's the first place where we can challenge the question. Borders are not there. They're not actually in the world. We put them there. Borders are like categories. We can't find them until we make them. So the only way we can challenge them is by thinking about how we've made them and how we can either unmake them or remake them in a new way. The border is not the river. The border is the floating border down the middle, or the concept behind the floating border that is an expression of power by the governor or by whoever puts it there. The border is not a natural phenomenon. The border is a decision collectively or communally made about how people are going to separate themselves. So my idea about thinking what is a border is really an opportunity to question the assumption that borders are natural. This is the one thing I want to stress by asking this question, and I think it's helpful to get students to think this, because they might assume, oh, a river is a border. The Rio Grande is actually the marker of a border, so it's the border. But borders are not there, and if we can question their naturalness, get students to think about the fact that these are arbitrary or collective, that these are at least conventional and not natural, then we've taken a step towards questioning or rehumanizing them as decisions we make in society. Certainly there are divisions of natural space that we could call borders, but that's, I think, slippage in our expression. When we say border, we're thinking political border, or we're thinking borders between humans. But really, natural borders are better called divisions or barriers, natural phenomenon. So you can have a river cutting through a valley, or you can have a canyon cutting through a mesa. These are not borders. They might also be overlain with borders that we choose to put there, but those are not the borders. There's an expression, the map is not the territory, which is a really interesting philosophical puzzle. You can also say that the border is not the river, right? The border is a decision about how to interpret the river. And I think that's something that students can learn, that they're the ones in charge of making the border, maintaining the border, or changing the border. This is not a new idea. Obviously, the discussion of the arbitrariness of natural things as markers of borders has already been thought of and questioned for a long time. There's a 17th century priest and philosopher, Pascal, many of you may have heard of him, who says something really interesting, kind of ironic, exclaiming, "It's a funny sort of justice marked by a river, true on one side of the Pyrenees and false on the other." In this case, he's questioning how the French, in particular, like to mark off, who they were at the time and think that something can be true on one side and false on the other. So he's very good at interrogating the idea that somehow a border is natural. And in this case, it's not a new idea, right? But I think it's a useful little phrase. It's a funny sort of justice marked by a river. And we could say the same thing about the Rio Grande. But his amusement or his irony points to the fact that the idea that borders are there is a way of forgetting that borders are part of geography, and geography is literally a practice. Geography is, in the words of one geographer, Ulrich Ostländer, if I got his name right, a kind of writing on the earth, literally, geography. That is a decision to write things on the earth, to inscribe or to draw a line in the sand. It's not mapping what's there, it's interpreting what we find as we go out there and deciding what to feature and what not to feature, how to interpret. So geography is also not, in the same sense, a natural science. It's a human science that interprets, say, the physical features of the natural world. It's an interpretation of space, and that's what border making is. Borders in this sense, like I said, are conventional. They're always agreed upon or they're fought over. They're never natural, and they're very rarely neutral. As in a game, borders are the rules. You don't play a game by simply finding the rules. You agree on the rules. Both sides have to decide what the rules are, and you abide by them. And if somebody breaks the rules, then they're somehow not playing the game. Borders are like rules in a game. Both sides agree, and then they play. Or they fight about the rules and say, not fair, or whatever, and try to make new rules. Sometimes they walk away from the game, if they can. So my idea is that borders require negotiation, affirmation, and constant reaffirmation. So when we talk about humanizing or rehumanizing migration, we're also thinking about the process of remaking borders. How is the next generation of people, or how are our students, going to make the new borders of the world? These are the young people who will become the leaders, who will rule countries and decide what's going to be done about these borders. Somebody is going to be there to make policies. No, it's not going to be AI. It's going to be the young people in our classrooms. So how can we teach them to question this practice? Obviously we can tell them, but anybody who's tried that knows that you can't just tell them. You have to find a way to make them understand, to make them ask the question before you provide any kind of answer. In fact, maybe your answer doesn't even matter. It's really, how can you lead young people to ask the question for themselves? And I'm reminded of something, maybe forgive me if this is a little bit cheesy, but I was reminded of this poem, and I thought this is a really helpful teaching tool. Sorry if everything's too small on this screen. A way of getting students to think about what walls mean. And this is from a poem by Robert Frost, the American poet, called Mending Wall. Maybe you've all heard of it or you read it in school, but I think it's a really useful poem. It's often read as attributing this sentence, "Good fences make good neighbors," to the poet. But really, if we read the poem carefully, it's a story about the poet going out onto his property and rebuilding the wall between his and his neighbor's property and suggesting maybe we don't need the wall. What do we need this wall for anyway, he says. As he suggests to his neighbor, before I built a wall, I'd like to know what I was walling in or walling out and to whom I was like to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. But his neighbor, of course, is tied to tradition and says what his father taught him to say. Good fences make good neighbors. So maybe that's not true after all. We can ask our students to decide, but we can present them with it as a puzzle. And I think this is a really lovely little poem that helps us question it. It gets at something that is really the sort of crux of my talk, and this is where I'm going to dive into a little bit of history, which is, I think when we ask the question, what is a border? We're delving into something larger, which is the question, what is border thinking? What is the assumption or the imaginary, we've used that word today, what is the mental map that's at play when we make a border or when we talk about migration? I think it's to say borders are not natural is also to say they're a construct, a decision, a category. So what is the thinking that goes into them? And this is a phrase I want to use or offer as a way to kind of historicize the question. What is border thinking? Particularly, border thinking is a set of assumptions about difference, about either where space starts and ends, or where power is distributed and then no longer applies, or jurisdiction, or particularly about who we are and who we're not. But essentially things I want to stress is that it's always abstract, right? It's never concrete. We make it concrete through application, but that border thinking, the imaginary word that we've used, the border imaginary, is always an abstraction, first of all. It's also legalistic. That is, it's a way of thinking about things in terms of process and in terms of rules, I guess. And it's also territorial. That is, it's about distributing or parsing up what's there. It's a way of deciding what's here and what's there, what's yours and what's mine. So the consequences of this, I think, are what really should be the most interesting to students. Where do we get these assumptions, or where do we get border thinking? How did we come to the point where we take it for granted that this is a natural process? And here's where I want to dive in a little bit. When I say our, what is our border thinking, or what is our history? I'm going to use this as an expression for Western, modern, and particularly 21st century. And in a world in which we think of migration as dehumanized, I think that the best way to think of border thinking, first of all, is that it is essentially jurisdictional. When I say legalistic, I also, it's a short way or another way of saying it's jurisdictional. Border thinking is a way of thinking legally about where power is distributed and what laws apply where. Many of us, of course, have had an experience of moving around the United States, I think, or of other countries that have provinces or regions in which the borders are nominal, but they're not actually that meaningful. They're legal divisions that might be divisions between counties or between certain areas, but nothing happens in our experience to make them meaningful. We can cross over a border without even knowing it, or something might be slightly different, and it doesn't really matter. It's really charming to drive to Oregon where you aren't allowed to pump your own gas. It's not really a big deal, but I'm reminded, oh yeah, I crossed the border, interesting. But then again, other times, borders that didn't quite matter can start to matter. And I think the recent Dobbs decision is an example of how the meaning of a border can change really quickly when the legal infrastructure around it changes. So the decision about which states are allowed to make which rules about healthcare and abortion suddenly changes. Suddenly states and their borders matter a lot. And we're in the middle of fighting over what that actually means to cross a border. Even to the extent of thinking, is a woman allowed to cross a state border for something else? Can the state that she left get involved and prosecute her, or get at all meddling in her experience of leaving that border into another space? That is, can one state know anything or care about what's done in another state? It's a really interesting question legally. But it gets at the point of how this border, which used to not actually matter in this question because of the way the law fell, now has been redefined and is actually in the process of being sort of decided. So without saying any more about it, I think that's one good example among many about how borders can go from benign to not benign really quickly, or vice versa. So what am I talking about? I want to tell you about borders before there were borders, right? A way of thinking that borders can go from one thing to another, or can go from nothing to something over time. And I think this is another lesson we can give students. By giving them a history lesson, putting borders in context, or putting migration in context, we can also help them become arbitrary or conventional and see that they can be changed, modified, or renegotiated. So when I'm telling you about the past I'm talking about is roughly between the years 500 and 1500. Those of you who are historians might care more or know what I'm talking about, but I'm really talking about the time between the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of European nation states. It's okay if you're not all that into that, but that's roughly where I'm at. So I want to show you some examples of borders, ways to think about space in the past. So here's a map of the Roman Empire, roughly at its largest extent, right? The Roman Empire extended all around the Mediterranean and further north, and it had ideas of its outer limits. It had ideas of borders, but they weren't exactly political borders. They were simply the limits of civilization, or the limits of where Roman laws were applied. They called them limits, limes, right? And they had them all over, and they kept trying to make them farther out by conquest, and they did really well. So we saw Hadrian's Wall earlier. That is one of the markers of one of the limes. But the idea of space in this is really different. These are not borders you cross. You don't cross in and out. It's simply saying this is the bubble, right? Things don't exist outside of this. We might make it bigger, but this isn't exactly an idea that somehow people cared where the border was. They wanted to simply live in the internal space. People didn't really migrate or immigrate into the Roman Empire. Jump ahead 700 years, or from here 700 to 700, 500 years. We're in a totally different world. When the Roman Empire goes away, the same space starts to be cut up by a bunch of different groups. But they didn't have exactly borders. They simply had contests for power. You don't have to pay attention to the details, but these are not states. This is a modern interpretation of where people might have been and what kinds of groups were fighting for power. They're not borders, because borders didn't exist in this world exactly. They didn't have borders. They had rough ideas about where one land turned into another land, maybe through natural landmarks. But when the Roman Empire's jurisdiction falls apart, everything inside of it is up for grabs, and lots of little groups start fighting over power. But they don't. Jump ahead again, and you start to see Europe trying to make those borders, but not yet doing it. So it's not the world we live in yet, but it's getting there. We start to see states being carved out. We start to see counties turning into larger kingdoms and borders being established for political reasons. But it's only over time that what we take for granted, that borders are expressions of political power, come to actually make sense in the way we understand it. Over this long period, hundreds and hundreds of years, many centuries after the Roman Empire, there was no concept of the use of actual physical space to delineate political power. Why? Because borders are thinking about the state in terms of its margins. Where does it stop? What is the extent of its jurisdiction? Up until this point, largely, political power was defined in terms of the center, not in terms of the outer margins. And I think this is what flips to get to the modern concept of borders that really matters to us. The place where we're going is a place in which the world starts to be carved up by empires. And carved up to the extent that they were fighting over the new space that was discovered, and they were starting to decide where the lines between yours and mine were drawn. And this, I want to say, starts with the convenient year of 1492. I actually teach a whole class on the year 1492 because I think it's so pivotal for so many reasons. Not only Columbus, but other things as well. The conquest of Granada, the expulsion of the Jews, the first Spanish grammar, etc. Lots of things happened in 1492 that mattered. But I also think that we start to get this shift from an older way of thinking about state power or political power that was directed inwards towards the centers of power, where are the capitals, who are the kings, towards a more legalistic, complete political view in which it's defined in terms of the margins. What is the extent of the king's power? How far out does it go, and where does it turn into the other king's power? This wasn't something that concerned people in the past. How can we tell? Here's where I want to get really deep. So, buckle up. We're going to go a little bit deeper, and I want to show you a medieval map or two. And I think, well, I won't say anything until you see it. So, here is a map of the world. This map is from about the year 1000. And it's a Roman original that was made in England in a completely Christian environment. So, where are we? Does anybody recognize anything? Africa. Looks like Africa, doesn't it? Totally does. But it's the whole world. So, what is it? It's not really that easy to figure out at all. But if you tip it on its side, now it makes sense. Right? Does it? No, it doesn't. So, where are we? It starts to make sense.
This map actually divides the world in a typical way, according to medieval maps made before the year 1500. The shape is called the TO map because it divides the world into three parts with a T shape inside an O shape.
The reason there are three is because these are three sons of Noah who, after the flood, populated one in each place. So there's no correspondence to our world at all. What year are we in? This is about the year 650. But it's actually not just common to the Christians. Here's a Muslim map, also dividing the world into three. So you think, where am I? What am I doing? The world is encircled by a gigantic ocean, and inside there are three land blobs: Africa, Asia, and Europe. Not because of the sons of Noah, this is for a different reason, but roughly the same idea, for religious purposes. Based on religious stories or myths about the population of the world, it's divided into three. What's interesting is that in this one, Europe and Africa are the same size, and in this one, Africa and Asia are the same size, and Europe is teeny weeny. But what's most notable is that there are no borders. Borders don't exist in this world. These are not borders. They're just boxes so you can organize whose name is going to go where. Because these names don't correspond to real space. The idea of a political border is not there. As I said, the use of borders to express political power hadn't been born yet. And certainly not in cartography. Here's another really interesting map from 1375. In this map, you start to see the world. You can't see it very well, but you can see the world as it exists. This map is super scanned online and you can teach with it. It's really useful because you start to see more or less the shape of the world as we might imagine it. If you look closely, Spain is here, Italy's here, Africa. It's roughly there without the Americas. And it's full of details about people and land. So like you can go and see the king of Mali, Mansa Musa, or you can see Kublai Khan over in China. Like there are actual people in the world and their political domains, but there's no borders. It's completely an open world of people and lands. So this is one of many different ideas that can help jar students out of thinking of borders as natural. By simply putting it in a historical chronology, we can start to think of borders as constructed. The next step is to ask them, well, when did this start and why? And that's where the story of the actual conquest of the Americas or the expansion of the Spanish Empire comes into play. We looked at a lot of sort of constructed walls, Hadrian's Wall or the Great Wall of China. You can also start pointing out, like, this is part of our natural imaginary. We're using walls to imagine new worlds too, like the Great Ice Wall in the Game of Thrones. We keep doing this even when we don't have to. So I think, to summarize what I'm saying here, first we can teach border thinking has changed over time. The assumptions about what we mean by a border have changed. That's a simple thought, but you can go as deep as you want with it. Any student at any level can get this, and I think it's a little jarring to start putting it in this newer context. Students go, wait a minute, if it's changed over time, what does that mean? That means that borders are expressions of political and social ideas. They're not natural. They're things that we find. If you want to go deeper, you can start putting it into historical context and actually explore the world as it was carved up. That is, the history of specific maps or the history of Spain. If you're talking in the history of if you're in Spanish class or in world history class, you can actually start exploring what happens in the conquest and how they start mapping the world. And then particularly, the conceptual shift in border thinking from center to margin and what that means for the larger world. So one thing I want to offer you as a way to do this, and this is, I don't have a lot of time, but I want to offer this as one strategy, which is if we look at a medieval map like this, you say, again, what does it mean? You don't have to be able to read it, but you can understand that it's totally different from our view of the world. I'll point out two details that I think are really handy to teach to students. A map like this always has a spot where nothing exists. And all medieval maps have a big blob where nothing exists. And they always say, this land is unknown to us. Literally, it says in this little red box, this is land we don't know. It's hot, we don't know it. Just leaves it at that, we don't know. If you go ahead into the future, 500 years, you look at a map like this, which is a typical Renaissance map. It's actually the one Wikipedia uses to represent maps. It's more or less the world that we look at. It has another blob at the bottom too. But now it's not this hot land over to the side that's really not defined. This one says specifically, this land is cold. Not yet known. We've gone from not known to not yet known. Why? Because suddenly, around the time of the Spanish conquest of the Americas and the expansion of the Spanish Empire, the world becomes a fixed quantity. We start to imagine the world as an actual thing that we can know in its totality. We can have it all. So it's not just that we don't know, it's that we don't yet know. We'll get there. We're going to map everything because everything is up for grabs. You can jump ahead in the world now and think, well, what do we do with space? We can map out every square inch of this planet. And in fact, this is a really interesting exercise to do with students. I don't know if anyone knows this app, What 3 Words? You can look up every square 3 meters on the face of the globe, including the middle of the ocean, and it's assigned a random 3-word combination of common English words. So you can look up where you're sitting right now, and it has a unique 3-word geolocator. It's really fun. And students love to play with this, so they can map out their own desk and say, where am I on the globe? What 3 words? This is a really good beginning to an exercise if you actually say, okay, where are you? Find yourself on the map or on the globe. and then say, okay, now what does it mean to live in a world where every single square inch is mapped out? Everything is known, and you can look it up in a second. And in fact, what technology or what kinds of power need to be in place for that to work? How many satellites has Elon Musk actually deployed and controlled so that you can do that? That's one way. Another way is to go into history again. If you're in a Spanish class, it's really useful to think about how carving up the world as a known entity can be a really useful exercise. One thing I like to do is offer students this map. Does anyone know about the Treaty of Tordesillas? This is so important. 2 years after Columbus, we have a treaty that divides the world into Spain and Portugal. Decides, here's a really good line. It's exactly halfway between Cape Verde, which already belonged to Portugal, and the new lands that Columbus had arrived at, the Bahamas. So everything on this side of the line becomes the land of Spain, or subject to Spain's conquest and dominion. Everything on that side, in the blue, becomes for Portugal. This is why we speak Spanish in Spanish America. Why San Diego is called San Diego. Why you can find millions of Portuguese speakers in Africa today. And in fact, why even tempura in Japan exists, because it's essentially from the Portuguese, because they had Nagasaki. So you can take this as far as you want as a conceptual idea. Oh, why is Spanish America and Brazil, Brazil? Why do they speak Portuguese there? Why are there millions of Portuguese speakers in Africa, or in Goa, or in Macau? How did these things happen, right? You can have students do projects on cities that are Portuguese speaking or Spanish speaking in really faraway places in the world, not your obvious places, and then from there build out and say, how did we get to this world? And find a specific moment in time when Spain and Portugal decided to carve up the known world as part of this larger process of knowing everything. You can also go in other directions and think, what lands do we have today that have not been carved up for politics? We only have a little bit left. Antarctica is the only non-claimed land, politically speaking, besides the sea. And it's already been carved up. There are at least 8 claims on Antarctica. So where does this get us? I want to stress that all of these are different ways of thinking of what I'm calling border thinking. And border thinking has a number of consequences that are really, really powerful to think about, to critique, and also to teach students to question or to think about. And one of them is that border thinking in terms of border, thinking in terms of state as the outer limit and not the inner limit, is about maximalizing either knowledge or power. It's about expansion and totalizing the possibility of state power or of knowledge or of any expression that's defined by that border thinking. So it can be really benign or it can be really, really dangerous. Whatever it is, it fills up the empty space. Border thinking is about delineation, and then it fills up whatever's inside of it. And I think that that's a really powerful thing to contemplate, because on the one hand, there are good things that come of it. This is also the foundation of the modern scientific worldview. How does science work? Except by walling off problems and asking smaller questions. So it's no coincidence that science has grown in the modern world at the same time as border thinking expanding and defining the modern political world. These things go hand in hand. It's not entirely a bad thing, but it's also something that is really, really worth critiquing. As we noted earlier, border thinking imposes a kind of logic that is binary. It has a tendency to define things in stark terms, either in or out, you or me, here or there, us or them, mine or yours. And I think in that sense, too, it's reductive. It's reductive, and what it does is imposes a problem, imposes a logic on a problem that is, I think, at risk of becoming dehumanized, precisely because it erases all of the nuance of any local situation. So a border becomes a political space that is either licit or illicit, legal or illegal. People on one side or the other have an explicit value. Border thinking is reductive thinking, and it's dehumanizing thinking. Whether it's abstract or whether it's really concrete, it's something which reduces their problems down to their most simple binaries. If we could go even further with this and think about the fact that we're in a world that's being increasingly defined by binary equations, that AI and really the larger expansion of data is a binary reduction. And I think we're at risk of going even further down this road towards the reduction of people to names and numbers that are part of this really rigid binary code. But I'm not going to go any further with that, only to suggest that you think about, or encourage your students to think about, how border thinking reduces in a binary way. And in that sense, it can be violent. One more thought, and I think that this is a really useful question for students just to contemplate, how whatever it is, borders, again, are not natural. They reflect society's values. This is from, does anybody know what border this is? Can anyone guess? This is North Africa. This is Spain. Spain has two enclaves in North Africa, Ceuta and Melilla, which are inside Morocco, but they're Spain, the actual EU territory. And then this is the fence with Morocco. So you have modern Europe playing golf, and you have the border wall behind it, in which people are constantly migrating and trying to get over. In 2015, there were 1 million people who tried to cross the borders. There are different ways of telling the story of those people, but one of the things we can do is to think about how we map this. I know I'm out of time, but I want to suggest a few last thoughts before we stop. And I think these are useful for students. We can tell migration in terms of maps and arrows and flows, or we can start telling it in terms of stories, right? To rehumanize border crossing is to tell stories about the people and the context of those border crossings. It's to get away from the data and get away from the stark facts of borders and to think about the experience of borders on the ground, how humans experience. So how many people die on the borders of the world each year? How many walls have been constructed, and how many more people have died since they've been constructed? Or to think about the same stories of stowaways trying to get over the border, such as in Gibraltar. Or even more, how we tell the stories of migration or don't. I don't know how many people noticed how last month we really told the story of the Titan disaster and the people who died tragically in that submarine. But we forgot about the over 500 people who the same week sank to the bottom of the Mediterranean. All migrants. We didn't tell that story. We told the other story about the really wealthy people. So why? Why does this story, which it happened at the same time, in the same way, the same exact deaths, drownings, tragically, why didn't we tell this story? Why are all of the 500 women and children, above all, from Pakistan forgotten? Well, we talked a lot about the other people who were also tragically killed. That's a decision as well. So I think there are powerful ways to tell the stories of migration that are to get away from polarizing kinds of political questions and thinking about human experiences. This was a really powerful way of telling the story of Syrian migration in the Mediterranean in 2015. But there are lots of other ways. We can tell the same stories that are happening all over the world in the Darien Gap. Who's migrating and what are they experiencing today? Or remember, the first people who died have just been found on the Mexican side of the new floating border. We can tell their story if we're telling the story of the border. Or the most recent stressed border, the Libyan-Tunisian border, where people are dying right now. So all of these things are ways of helping students to question borders and then to think about ways of rehumanizing migration over borders. But ultimately, the lesson is two. Migration is natural, but borders are not. And if we can get students to think that, we can get them to think a lot more based on that. Thank you.